Rancho Mirage, staying with friends. I am in, obviously, not in New York, where I live. I'm a set designer, and I have a home in Tucson in the desert, where I've been spending the quarantine. And after Broadway shut down on March 13th, and I'm thrilled to be here this morning. It's very early here. It's early here in the morning. It's 5:30. The desert's starting to wake up, and it's a place where I grew up, the desert, and it's been very important to me. And I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about creating worlds on stage, which is my job and my work. I grew up out here. I have a twin brother who's in fashion, and we were both very, very young when we began, I guess, our life's journey. And my family moved to Arizona. And as a child, I enjoyed looking at houses and drawing. And so that's why I pursued, when I went to school, a degree in architecture. And I was always very interested in arts and artists and history of art. And so in that vein, when I got to architecture school and started doing projects where I was designing projects and different requirements from the classes, I was always more interested in how people felt in their spaces. I guess that's the best way to put it. I was always interested in the emotional content of the spaces that I was designing. When I was young, I wasn't exposed to much theater. I was in a small town. I saw a few road shows. I remember seeing the Tour of the King and I. It was, I think, maybe the first theater show I ever saw, and was kind of mystified and dazzled by the experience. And then I remember thinking, when I would watch the Tony Awards on TV, back when they would show the designers and the costume sketches, the models of the scenic designers and the lighting, and it was just all so fantastic. But I just remember thinking, these people have such an elaborate hobby, and thinking that couldn't, what was their day job, that it wasn't possible to have that as a career. And then as I began to pursue my studies at school, I realized, well, it was indeed a career, and people did indeed do that for a living, and it was kind of opening up a world of magic for me. And so during my architecture career, I began to study at the theater school as well, and both colleges were very instrumental in my pursuits, so that was really important to me. And so as I got through architecture school, I loved that degree so much, and I loved that program so much, so I decided that I wanted to finish that pursuit, because also I came from a very small town, and when you aren't aware of the arts, I sort of wanted to make sure that I had a solid base and a solid foundation. So I had this architectural degree and knew that I needed to do more work. And so when I did that, I decided I wanted to study with Ming-Cho Lee at the Yale School of Drama. So I moved to New York and then worked for a while. I was an art director in independent film, and kind of fell into that a bit, which was exciting, and then applied to the School of Drama. So that's where I studied. So I studied design at Yale with an incredible educator, along with a lighting designer like Jennifer Tipton, costume designers Jess Goldstein and Jane Greenwood, these incredible faculty. And it was through this process of examination and thinking about how I wanted to do the work that I wanted to accomplish, and it became this balance of architecture, which is where my life and my education is rooted, and the kind of theater that I enjoy most very often has a modern take to it. So when I studied, one of the things that I studied in an architecture school that was very, very influential to me was I had a semester in Italy, and I studied very closely the Renaissance where I was living, but most importantly in Florence, and most importantly I spent a lot of time in Rome, and I was very lucky to be able to go as a student. But I fell in love with the plasticity of the Italian Baroque architects and how people would shape spaces, most often religious spaces, to just for awe-inspiring work for people. And I just think most fondly of even St. Peter's Basilica. Out in front, the colonnades that were added by Michelangelo and Bernini. Bernini did these incredible columns to kind of create this almost anxiety of approach to, or more like wonder, the idea of wonder as you approach the facade of St. Peter's, and when you reach the sort of terminus of this colonnade that's like a half circle, you would emerge and then see the elevation of St. Peter's when it was its most sort of impressive. And I was just that always made a huge impression on me. And then another architect, Borromini, who did a ton of false perspective work in ceilings to make them look more exaggeratedly deep from a bystander below, ceilings looking majestically taller. So false perspective became something that was very important to me. And I studied that quite a lot. And so those are some of the things that I looked to as I moved into the work that I was doing in the theater. The interesting thing is architecture, my foundation is in such a sort of concretized, working with real materials and things like that. And then my work in theater is very ephemeral and intangible, and we're very often trying to create moments that are memorable and unforgettable. And it's something that's almost very hard to capture on camera or on film, and architecture is very different. You can capture it from many perspectives. It's much more timeless, and I like the contrast of both of those worlds. And I do some architectural design, but my world and my life has been built around creating ephemeral moments and spaces on stage. So narrative structure and storytelling is the most important thing to me. And so when I start a project, the script is the first thing. And I mean, most often, even like a couple of weeks ago, a director called me about a project and sent the material right away, and I fell in love with it and was then again excited. And also in this time of quarantine for us here, having a project like that you look forward to down the road and that you can dream about now is fantastic. And that is very much how I'm spending this time now. A number of my projects, I was in the middle of on Broadway in rehearsals in our first week of previews for a revival of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Laurie Metcalf, who's won, now I think 3 Tony Awards, 2 right after each other consecutively. And we've worked together before, and this is with the director Joe Mantello. And it was a production we were all incredibly proud of. And then I was moving on to, once that was open, going to do American Buffalo by David Mamet, and a revival of that with brilliant actors Lawrence Fishburne, Sam Rockwell, and Darren Criss. And both of those sets are still in the theaters and awaiting Broadway to reopen. American Buffalo is set to reopen in the spring of next year, which I'm grateful for. And when I think about the worlds of creating those on stage, they're both very, very different. They both take place in realistic settings, which many plays often do. And I feel like writing is such a response to the human experience, and when we're doing things that we can relate to, that's how we're able to kind of move people and touch people's emotions and have a huge impact and create memorable moments on stage. So that's my experience doing in play design. And so I'll look at the script as kind of the first thing I'll do, and then conversations with the director. And the director will be incredibly important on the journey to our production. And the idea of what kind of a space are we creating for the actors and for these words to be spoken, if it is a play. If it's a musical, similarly. If it's a musical, I'm in the middle of storyboarding one now that we were going to be doing in December, and it will be obviously next spring, knock on wood. And that's where I start really storyboarding moments, and I do very small sketches, and I wish I could show you things here because my world is so visual. And but we'll keep this as a conversation. I've sketched some of the theaters that I've worked in. I sketched the marquee of the Booth Theater where Virginia Woolf was and is really on stage now. And so back to creating these worlds, I very often will start with thumbnails as I'm reading a script, and I'll draw little tiny sketches in the margins of the script or on my sketchbook, which is, always with me, and just impressions or thoughts. And they may be very realistic, and they may be completely unrelated to the text or unrelated to what you think is going to be important, but just somehow an instinct. And it might be an impression of a sentence that I've read, or it might be an impression of the room, what that style of room may be, or even the musical, some thoughts about what's a research list to do. And then I'll kind of put those in a place, because I think your initial responses are very important. And it means that's your first impression. It's the first thing that kind of came to you while you were working on it. And to at least give it that kind of importance. And then I very much then I have a very deep conversation with the director about the goals for the production, like how we want it to feel, what's the tone. And sometimes you won't even discover whether it's realistic or not realistic, and that's a process that you go through together, and that's exciting. And very often, like I'm just speaking about those two plays, Virginia Woolf and American Buffalo, both quite realistic, but the Virginia Woolf set that I just did, actually, our approach to it was much more, I think, it was very ambitious, which was exciting, and it's not the Virginia Woolf that most people would expect. So I do hope that someday we're able to have that, and to for the world to be able to see it. But it became about the idea of how do we show this marriage, and it became about moments within the marriage that we wanted to highlight within the spaces that are very necessary, and the space that is necessary to tell that play. But how could it deconstruct through the evening during these act breaks and pauses to illuminate the marriage, so by the end the sort of trappings of a naturalistic room had been kind of stripped away, so that all you were left with were the people and the situation and the furniture in that room that was needed to tell the story. And so that was a very, very interesting process to go through. And Joe Mantello, the director, is brilliant. Differently, American Buffalo, both of these are revivals of plays for Broadway. The director of American Buffalo, another brilliant man, an actor as well, Neil Pepe. And the Mamet play really needs to have a kind of realistic space of sorts to handle a lot of the requirements of the script. And we were doing that in a space where we had a thrust. So we were kind of surrounding the actors on three sides. So much of it was almost like as though and it takes place in a junk store in the 70s. So that space kind of exists as an island, but what we did above it was a very important ceiling of the installation that became important for the intimacy of the audience, important to kind of create a sort of ceiling for the sort of pressure cooker of this space, which has a big climax and a big climactic kind of event that takes place in it, and then would also facilitate the needs of the narrative structure of the play. And So those are two kind of approaches to plays. And then basically what I'll do is I'll sketch, and then I'll start putting some images together and much more realistic or more real sketches or impressions that are taking those initial thumbnails, expanding them into larger drawings, and then beginning to find my way around them. And then I will share them with the director, and then we'll have an initial conversation about those, and we'll see how he or she feels about the direction, and then I will take those notes. And then what we try to quickly do is we get into models. So it goes back to when I was a child working in the arts and then in architecture school. These models become so important. They're very realistic, three-dimensional models. They can be, pretty big, but we make these very real models so the director can really get their head in there and see what the world wants to be, and what my work is looking at like for them. And they are then also looking at the audience's point of view, which is incredibly important to be able to articulate each of those moments very, very specifically. And that is a part of the process that I love so much, being very, very specific about what the director sees, and then translating that into my drawings for the set, and which then go to the workshops and for the fabrication and the build of the scenery. And so that's a process that I supervise incredibly closely throughout the engineering, the building, the budgeting, and then also when we're in rehearsal, making sure that we are taping out in rehearsal rooms the perfect space, and just getting that ready for all the actors, so that the actors. So I'm really supporting the text, the playwrights, the musical writers, and the directors, and then the performances that are going to be on these spaces and within these spaces for the audiences. And then we'll get to on stage where that is all being installed together, and that's exciting to me because it's starting to come together. You've been working in sort of a small scale, and then into a much larger world where you can really see the impact of the work that you're doing. And that's where these ephemeral moments that you want to create in theater that are going to be memorable for audiences can really happen. And that's when I'm engaging with the lighting designer most closely. Those people, lighting and costumes, are always with me in the process, and we're always working together very closely. But that's the first time that lighting is kind of joining what I call joining the party. And it's incredibly important to me because lighting is is the lens through which my work is viewed. So we work very, very closely together, and that is always the case. And it's something that even in my personal life, I'm always interested in how light is working. It's very early here, and I can see the sunset is coming up there. Behind me, there's sort of a skylight. So lighting is an incredibly important part of the work that I'm doing. I just want to look at my notes for a second. That's talking about a couple of plays. So Virginia Woolf, and that's shaping very, very tight and specific moments was going on with those two plays before we shut down Broadway. And I'm just speaking most specifically about those projects because for me they're the most recent and they're most fresh. And while I was doing that, I was getting ready to begin a revival of the musical 1776 that was being done by another brilliant director, Diane Paulus, with whom I've worked over 20 years. We did the Tony Award-winning revival of Pippin, for which I was nominated for Tony. And we were doing 1776, which was going to begin as a national tour and then be on Broadway in the spring. We're going to probably go directly to Broadway in the spring after we do our rehearsals at the theater where Diane is the artistic director at ART at Harvard. And the thrilling thing about that was it was a very diverse cast that was cast as women. And that very traditional musical being seen through the lens of female actors was very, very exciting, and to see the nation's history in that musical, which won a Best Musical in the 70s, that was exciting. And then I'm working on two new musicals now, and I was in the middle of building a model for one of them when we had to basically stop production. Scott, can you share which of the scenic design made me my favorite set design? That's a tough one, because but it's a great question, so thank you for that, and I'm thrilled to have a conversation about that. Some of them are memorable for many different reasons. My very first Broadway set design, which was a transfer from off-Broadway, was for a musical called Urinetown. And it happened that we were moving to Broadway, and it's a great musical, another musical comedy, and I seem to love musical comedies. The Book of Mormon is another one of my favorites, and that was where I won my 3rd Tony Award for Book of Mormon. Urinetown, we were set to open September 12th, 2001. So we were very late into previews, and then the towers fell. One of my favorite musicals was for Urinetown. And it was meaningful because it was my first, but it was also a very transformative environment. And we took the theater and turned it into almost a place for incarceration, which was reflective of the kind of environment that the musical was taking place in. So that's a very important one to me. A play by Martin McDonagh called The Pillow Man is also a very, very important one to me. And that one I began in England at the National Theatre years ago, and then it came to New York and premiered on Broadway. And it's a very dark toned, I wouldn't call it a dark comedy, but it's a very dark story. And if you haven't read it, it's definitely worth reading. It's such an incredible play. And Martin, who's just a brilliant writer, it was a thrill to work with him. I had done The Lieutenant in Ishmore, which is another play of his, shortly after that. His play, The Beauty Queen of Leenane, had premiered I think a couple of years before, to much acclaim, and he's fantastic. But The Pillow Man was very important. I did a revival of the musical Nine with Antonio Banderas, Chita Rivera, Jane Krakowski, kind of an incredible all-star cast, and I was quite young when that happened, and that was just a very, very important step in my career and my growth as a designer. Some thoughts on my work. Oh, great, okay. The play A Steady Rain. A Steady Rain is a collaboration with one of my dearest friends, the director John Crowley, who is astonishingly brilliant. He's a British director in film and television and theater. In fact, I'm the godfather of his son, and brilliant friend, brilliant director. We did The Pillow Man together, and we very early on did a play together at the Donmar Warehouse called Tales from Hollywood. And I remember when we were about to do A Steady Rain. It was being produced by Barbara Broccoli, who does the Bond films. And so A Steady Rain was a play that I did many years ago, and I was asked by Barbara Broccoli, who was working with Daniel Craig on the James Bond movies, about reading this play. And John Crowley, the director, is going to direct that. So I read it, and we were going to originally do it in London, and then I was in London working on it with them, and Hugh Jackman then was interested in working with Daniel on it. So Steady Rain began, it's a two-hander, like what we call two-hander, play with two actors, and I began doing those very small sketches. It's scheduled, it takes place in an interrogation room by a policeman, and what John, the director, and I wanted to do was to try to make it much more surreal. And so we began with the idea of, and what I sketched very quickly were there were, I think, 6 significant places that happen in events that happen within the play. And I thought, what about if we start in a black void and we just have the curtain go up and you see Daniel Craig and Hugh Jackman sitting there, which already would put the audience at this kind of like moment of realization, like not just have a realistic room and a door opens and in come the actors and then here it starts to play. Like the curtain is up and they're both sitting there. So you already start with a startling idea and a startling moment for the audience to kind of really engage them from the moment. And it's a play about storytelling. It's really this very specific story that's happening back and forth, and it's being told from 2 points of view. And as it's being told, very specific visions would kind of appear behind them. And they were very elaborate sets that were showing up behind a black screen. It was a dark void. And so each significant moment that they were talking about would appear behind them, and then it would disappear. And they were 3-dimensional, very huge kind of, it would be the side of a building with a light that would turn on, where a room that they were speaking about would kind of just appear there. And then it would fade out. And then I remember the next time a building would appear and it would just slightly move. So the pieces moved and then the light would go back, like the lighting back there would drift out and you would be back in a black void. And there were 2 lamps over both of the actors at all times, like they were in this interrogation room together. And Hugh Vanstone, who's a brilliant lighting designer, lit that production, and he is just fantastic. How scenic design is important. I mean, I think I'll finish Steady Rain quickly, but I think that, like, for Steady Rain, it was really creating about this void, this very dark void, and letting this almost ghost story happen, because at the end you find out that one of the characters is not alive. And so it was being told in sort of as a sort of flashback. And so to make that much more magical and surreal, I decided to make it into a sort of a surreal stage set, really, where the moments were kind of drifting and ethereal, and at the end when you realize that it's almost a ghost story, that everything is drifted apart. So these visions that have just kind of like magically appeared fall away, and then you are set with the play. Okay, do I feel projection on an LED screen takes away from real theater skills? You know, I don't. I don't think LED and projection is right for every play or project. I think that it can enhance plays when it's used very well, and then in the case of one that I did recently, I did this design for Tina Fey's musical Mean Girls, and the whole set is a half circle of projection of LED screens. And we did it, the director and I decided to do that so that we could make sure that we were keeping very quick pace with the script and making sure that we were like as nimble as the script was. And there were pieces of scenery that would come in and work with it and would create entrances. So you still have to make sure you're creating a world. It's not just putting a screen there and letting that become the scenery. It's like, in a way, it became an atmosphere. And I think that, for me, is the difference. I think LED and projection design is very important as atmosphere. Have I ever had clashes with my director or producer for the budgets of the sets? No. I mean, sometimes we'll get to a place where the budgeting is tricky, but it's so important, and especially now that we make work that can last if we're doing commercial projects, that they have a sort of longevity, and the longevity is best when we are staying on budget, and it gives the show a better shot at running longer. And in a non-commercial setting, staying on budget, because these institutions have a very important work to do. And so often there's education, there's the projects that we're doing in the theater, so there's many kind of arms to the budget. So staying on budget is an important responsibility of my job. And if there's something where we're not, if I'm not getting there, which is rare, or if we have to make a compromise, which is very often, that's why I think being a good designer, you are kind of adapting to the situation. I feel like sometimes the best design is coming from constraint, and you have to be clever, and we are, again, being mentally nimble with our ideas and making sure that if you have a strong concept that we can figure out how to translate that with a budget. What helps me most to design? The narration of script, or do I prefer reading the script and then going on the floor, and then going on floorboard? I first, of course, definitely read the script, and then I will start some research and some sketches, and I'll listen to the conversation that the director and I are having and take his or her impressions of what the kind of story they want to tell and what kind of spaces. And sometimes they may not have any idea at all, and it's a discovery for both of us. And then we start bringing the other kind of collaborators into that meeting process when I get a little farther down the road, when I have some initial impressions for people to kind of respond to, and the producer becomes a part of that. Okay, so in Steady Rain, were the backdrops that faded in and out set pieces or LED? They were set pieces. They were very elaborate set pieces that were built in very extreme false perspective, and the back wall in the theater was all carpeted, very, very, it was all black carpeted, and all backstage everything moved incredibly slowly so that we didn't hear anything. But no, they were all side-lit pieces of scenery, so they were all built pieces. Thank you for that. That was great and super perceptive of you to have asked that question. How important is scenic design for me as theater, as an actor's medium? I mean, for me, I think the set is unfinished until the actors are on the stage. So sets never quite feel right until the performers are on the stage. There's always a sort of emptiness, and literally. And I sort of want to make sure that I'm always kind of keeping, I always draw with figures in my drawing so that I know what potential space and entrances and the dynamics in the room, how can people move in there interestingly, and how the director and I will talk about, okay, that person enters from there in Act 2, or just how we're keeping that dynamic. That's very important. So as far as an actor's medium, it's of greatest importance for me that it's an actor's medium, because I'm really there to support the actors, and my work is the background for them, and I can facilitate the spirit and the character and the emotional content, and help accentuate moments and create the general feeling for the show, and then down to the specific spoon that they're maybe using. So I think that whole range is very important to me. How difficult is it to make a set which is to transport from one country to another? There are so many people, and our work in theater, is such a huge collaboration, and so many brilliant people involved, from the people on my side of things to sound and lighting and costume, and then also into the engineers that are at the shops building the scenery that I'm overseeing, and the people that are even in my studio working with me to figure out the complexities of a set design. But usually when we're doing a set to travel, there are so many people that are working with us to help figure that out. And I'm really most responsible for the visual aspects of the production. And because I trained as an architect, I know quite a bit about engineering, and I've worked with the engineers for so many years that we all kind of work together on that. But very early in the beginning stages of a tour, it's important that we know the parameters and how fast we need to get from one city to the next, how long is our load in, and that really then dictates the complexity of the set. So that's hopefully an answer to that question. What material do I normally use when making a set? That's tricky because I think it's different for every set. Because I hope that I'm trying to, or hope that I'm responding to the work in a way, and the materials for me are reflective of each set, I think, and each play or musical that I'm doing. American Buffalo, there's a lot of timber, a lot of wood, and that's helpful because that's the kind of building that we're in, and the texture and the decay of this antique store that we're in, or this junk store that we're in. For Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, it takes place in a living room, and I pushed this living room in a direction that felt more contemporary, but still of the period in which the play was written. So the floor was made of cork, and then with some made carpets on top of it, so I could see the pattern of feet that the actors were moving around the space in. And then a huge bookshelf that was all made of steel. And so that's one. And then wood and timber and plaster are very often a part of our vocabularies for materials. Let's see. Okay, cool. I think I'm gonna say thank you. Thank you so much, the Coconut Theater, for having me. I'm wishing you all the best. All right, take care.